Do you have a seller that needs to stay in their home for a bit after the end of your sale? Or do you have a buyer that's looking to move into a vacant home prior to the end of the actual sale? Have you been curious as to what that contract looks like when that sort of situation comes up? If so, stay tuned and I'll show you exactly how to write that in the contract so that your seller and or your buyer is fully protected. Hey agents, if you don't know me already, my name is Joe Skipper and I'm the owner of Skipper Realty Group, brokered by eXp Realty. And today I wanted to dive into an addendum on the real estate contract that's going to protect your seller or your buyer if they want to live in the home past the end of the sale or before that sale closes. And if you haven't already, if you could do me a huge favor and hit that like button, I would truly appreciate it. Also, if you want to stay up to date on the latest marketing techniques and information out there for real estate agents, then consider subscribing to my page. I put out content regularly so that you can be more successful and thrive in this career as a real estate agent. But before we get into it, I am not a lawyer and I'm not qualified to give you any legal advice on this contract. Your specific contract and client are each different and each sale is unique. So this is a guide to how to fill this out. It's not a legal class, but it's going to help you to understand this addendum better so when this scenario comes up, you are ready to go for it. Okay, so let's take a look at my computer and take a look at the real estate contract addendum that deals with this specific issue. Hey guys, okay, so we're going to go into my computer. We're going to take a look at the PDF version of the Oregon real estate forms, the OREF forms on the agreement to occupy prior to close and the agreement to occupy after close. We'll just walk through it. I'll show you what the forms are used and then how your client may be using them or how you use them for your client to protect them in this event that they need to stay after a sale or they need to move in prior to the sale actually closing. So let's take a look. Let me share my screen with you right now. Okay, here's the agreement to occupy before closing. This is the OREF form. Again, your client's specific needs and their wants and desires may be different than this. I'm just showing you what form it is and how to use it and how you fill it out for your client just so you have more comfortable on it. Because when I first got it and I had a client that needed to stay after, I didn't know how to do it. So I had to learn this on my own. So hopefully this will help you out. But this is the Oregon OREF forms, agreement to occupy before close. Again, as in all contracts, make sure that you read through every single line and know that if you need to fill it out, put an NA, put whatever you need to do, but just make sure everything is filled out correctly and appropriately. Your sales agreement, when you do the sales agreement, will be there. Whatever numbers you use, whatever letters you use, that'll be up there. You'll put your sellers in there. The property address will be in there. Let's go to the first part. This is the occupancy. It says the seller will grant to the buyer the right to occupy the property before closing during the term described in section 2. However, during that term, the seller will have exclusive use of the following portions of the property. If a seller is granting the buyer the right to occupy the property, but the seller needs to access the property, say a shop or a shed or whatever it may be, this is the part where you would say the seller will have exclusive use of the following portions. So you would say they need the shop, they need to access the shop, they need to access the master bedroom or whatever it may be. That's where you'd put it in there. If there's nothing, if they don't need to use the property, if they're moved out and they don't care, then you just leave it blank or you put not applicable. Okay, number 2, the term. This agreement will commence not more than 90 calendar days before the closing deadline. Buyer's right to occupy will begin on, so it can't commence on more than 90 days, so 3 months prior, which is never going to happen. Well, it may, but it's very rare. So what you're going to do, this section is when they're able to occupy the property. When they're going to occupy, put the exact date. It will autofill that date. And continue until you're going to put the date of closing or you're going to put anything particular for your client. So that was where you put those sort of things. We'll go down on compensation. You can select one of these. So this is at the time of the signing this agreement or on a certain date, the buyer will pay rent in the amount of X per day during the term. If the term will continue for more than 30 calendar days, buyers will pay rent as follows. So this is where you would put any compensation amount that your client is wanting or none. If it's 0, you will put 0 per day. If anything that you need, anything in particular that you need, the compensation amount will go here. Buyer will pay rent to the seller at the following address. You can put an address in there for the seller. If any rent is unpaid for 4 calendar days after the due date, then in addition to any other remedies available to the seller, buyer will pay a late charge of blank. If it's not filled in, it's $50 per day. If your client wants a certain amount, put that certain amount in there. If not, it's going to be $50. If your client doesn't care, just put $50 in. And it will commence on the 5th calendar day until all rent and late charges are fully paid. That kind of goes into the nitty-gritty of the late payments from the buyer. We're going to scroll down to the purpose. Buyer will use the property exclusively as a private residence and will not allow more than blank persons to occupy the property without the prior written consent of the seller. So this is basically saying if your buyer has 3 kids and a husband or wife, then they're 5 total. So you'll put in there, if your seller's like, I don't want any more people than is allowed, or who's buying it, then you put that number in there, whatever your client wants. Buyer has inspected the property. So we're going to move on to section 5, repair services and maintenance. Buyer has inspected the property and accepts the property as an as-is basis with the exception of the following repairs. If the buyer needs any repairs done or sees any repairs that are done or need to be done, this is where you put that in. Generally speaking, if the home is of the condition that the buyer wants, this is left blank. But if your buyer or your seller agree, this is where you put in any maintenance issues or any things that need to be fixed. Down here, your buyer's initials, your seller initials, as always on each page. Let's see here. This is the bottom portion of this. This one is kind of confusing, so you want to read this because it jumps onto the next page. But throughout the term, the buyer will, at buyer's sole expense, maintain all utilities and services, heating, cooling, sewer, water, blah blah blah, and any built-in appliances and equipment in normal working order. Keep the roof watertight and maintain the grounds. Buyer will make no alterations to the interior of the or exterior of the property without the seller's prior written consent. This is important. It jumps pages, but it's such an important topic because what it's saying is the buyer, as the renter, is going to keep the house as is and not mess with anything until closing. If there's any exceptions that you guys have decided as a seller or buyer that, hey, you can paint the house, I don't care, paint the interior, whatever it may be, you can put that in here. But this is basically the contract is saying, buyer, you can't do anything to the house without the seller's written approval. Number 6, the fuel. If any heating, oil, propane, or other fuel tank is on the property on the date the buyer is entitled to occupancy, you can either check on the date of buyer's occupancy, buyer will pay seller for the fuel outside of escrow at the rate paid by the seller, or B, the fuel is included with the property at no stated value. So this is basically like if you have generally a farm property with oil tanks or propane tanks, who's going to pay for what? Who's paying for what's inside there? Who's, as a buyer seller. So this is if you have any fuel related topics to talk about with your seller and your buyer, this is where you'd figure that out for each. This is kind of the legal risk of loss stuff. There's nothing you have to fill out here, but this is something your seller and you need to know about if the transaction fails to close and those sort of things. Number 8, the cleaning fee. This is something you will pay. This is something you will fill out. The buyer will pay a fee of blank, $500 if not filled in, which seller will use to clean and restore the property if the transaction fails to close. And any unused portion will be refunded to the buyer. If the transaction closes, escrow will credit the amount to the buyer. So that's basically saying this is if the sale doesn't fail, I need this much money to clean the house up. Number 9 is important. Pets. The buyer and you select one is or is not permitted to keep pets on the property. If permitted, pets will be limited to. So you either say no, you can't have pets on the property until it sells, or you say yes, you can, and these are the pets that I allow. So cats, dogs, or birds, or whatever you want. This is where you'd fill that out so that the buyer will know what they're allowed and what they're not allowed. It does say the buyer will promptly repair any damage caused by the buyer's pets if this transaction fails to close in accordance with the sales agreement. So it does say the buyer is going to pay for anything. These are some access and repair, different encumbrances and things like this. This is a lot of the legal mumbo jumbo, but you need to know it and understand it so that you can explain it to your client. The next section that we have to fill something out in is number 14. It's the insurance. Seller will maintain the property and casualty insurance on the property. So the seller will maintain their insurance on the property. Buyer will bear the risk of loss to the buyer's personal property on the property. And at least 5 business days before the term starts, buyer will obtain and maintain a renter's insurance policy with an insurance company authorized in our state, the state of Oregon, with a single limit liability of not less than $500,000. Basically, that says the buyer has to get an insurance policy, a renter's insurance policy for the home during that time at a minimum of $500,000 if it's not filled in. If you have a really expensive home, you may want to do more. If you don't, at the minimum, $500,000 is what they have to do. So make sure that's filled out. If it's not filled in, it's $500K, but make sure your seller is clear that it's $500K. If they want more, then you put that in the contract. Nothing else needs to be filled out, but again, the disclaimer, read all this stuff, know what it's talking about up until the buyer holdover. Number 16. If a buyer fails to close the transaction according to the terms of the sales agreement and remains in possession of the property beyond the term, seller may bring an action for possession as provided by the law. In addition, seller will be entitled to recover from the buyer blank. So we can choose 2 different things. You can only select one. A liquidated damage sum of blank, whatever you want, whatever the seller wants to put in, or an amount equal to 2 months rent or twice the actual damage sustained by the seller, whichever is greater. Parties must sign and deliver any agreement to extend buyer's occupancy beyond the term. Unless the otherwise agreed in writing, the extended occupancy will be on the same term as this agreement. So it's up to your seller. Do they want 2 months rent or twice the actual damage sustained by the seller? Or do they just want a chunk of money, whatever that may be? So make sure your seller knows that, what they want and what they want to do. The delivery of the keys from the seller to the buyer. So seller will deliver to the buyer one set, you can choose one complete set of keys before the first day of the term, and the remaining keys at closing, all the keys before the first day of the term, or other. So that's where you'd handle like the transfer of the keys to the buyer. Seller will handle the delivery of the keys before the beginning of the term as follows. So this is, again, just that section of how you're going to deliver that. Some legal stuff that we all need to know about. Any other additional provisions that you want to put in this agreement goes in right here. And then your buyer and seller will sign and print that. That's the end of the occupy before closing. So a lot of this stuff is going to be the exact same, but it's occupy after closing. This is generally when a seller sells, they close, and they need like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks to move out. I've had clients up to a lot of time, but this is where you do it. Same thing, sellers, property address. The first thing that we do is occupancy. The buyer grants the right to the seller to occupy the property after close. And so now the buyer is now the owner of that property. They're letting the seller now be the renter. So it's just the opposite thing. Use exclusive portions of the following portions of the property. Again, if the buyer says, hey, when we close, I need to get into the shop or I need to get into the barn. So then you put that in there that they need access to that sort of stuff. The term is the exact same. You're going to do this one is you can occupy the property as the seller with it beginning on the closing date and continue until. So sometimes the client will say, hey, I just need 14 days. So 2 weeks after closing. So you'll put whatever time, 14 days after closing. Or if they need on a specific date, you're like, hey, on this date, you can put it in this section by that time. So that's the term agreement for that. Compensation, same sort of thing as the occupy before close. Seller will pay the rent at the rate of X per day, per week, per month. Total amount is this. So you'll put the total amount of the rent in there. You can do it in a lump sum to escrow and disperse to the buyer at the time of closing or after closing in periodic installments. So that's kind of your payment section and how you're going to figure out how to pay it. Generally, it's easier to just put it into escrow and escrow will distribute it, but your client may be different and want something different. This one's is the same thing. If rent is unpaid for 4 days after the due date, seller will pay a late charge of, if not filled in, $50. But if your buyer wants that and wants more, put that in there. That's kind of the late stuff. This purpose, the seller will use it for a property exclusively as a private residence and will not allow more than blank amount of people. So same sort of thing. If the seller has 4 people in the house, you can put 4, whatever your buyer wants. So seller's obligations, this is like keeping everything in condition. It's basically like, I don't want to say it's a rental agreement because it's not, but it basically has the seller's obligations to keep the house in proper working order. This is all the legal stuff. You don't have to fill anything out except there. Some of the buyer's responsibilities of the home. And then in fuel, same sort of thing. Who's paying for the heating, the oil, the propane, and all that sort of stuff. That you can check the box on whether the fuel is included with the property or whether the buyer will pay the seller for the fuel outside of escrow, that sort of stuff. So if you have a fuel tanks, make sure that that's filled out properly so it protects your buyer or your seller, whoever you're representing. The security deposit, so you can not pay a security deposit at all, or you can pay a security deposit in the amount of $500 if not filled in. You just check this box, and then you can either do it directly to the buyer or directly to escrow for disbursement. So that would be if you want some sort of security deposit paid to you, you'd put it in there. So if the seller vacates the property under the terms of this agreement and there are no damages or defaults, buyer will, within 3 business days following the date the seller notifies the buyer that the property is vacant, refund that entire security deposit. So that's basically if everything works out great, they put a security deposit of say $500 in, nothing is wrong with the property, that buyer has to give the money back to the seller. Damages, this goes into the damage section. This is all the legal stuff that you need to be aware of. Pets, the same sort of thing. What's the seller allowed to be permitted once it closes? How many pets? What pets they are? Insurance and destruction, same sort of thing. The seller needs to obtain renter's insurance policy with an insurance company authorized by our state of Oregon with a single limit liability coverage not less than $500K. So again, the seller now has to have renter's insurance to cover any damages that may happen. A lot of the legal stuff. So this is if the seller fails to vacate the home at the end of the term. You can do the liquid damage. You can do an amount equal 2 months rent under this agreement or twice the actual damage, an amount equal to the daily principal, interest, taxes, insurance, according to accruing under the buyer's notes, and the trust deed for each day following the date the buyer is entitled to possession or other. So choose which one you want, what your seller and or buyer wants, and check that box and make sure that's filled out. The delivery of the keys from the seller, this is the same thing. Am I giving you one set of keys? Am I taking the whole thing? Am I going to deliver it after we're done? That sort of stuff. Make sure that's been decided and both parties are happy with that. A bunch of the legal stuff again. Any other additional provisions that you have, sorry about that, any other additional provisions that you have for your clients that you want to put in there to protect them. And that's it. So this can look super complicated, and it can be complicated, but I just, once you get through that sort of stuff and you can see how all that works and see how those forms check down and go through, it actually is pretty simple. Just know what your seller wants and or your buyer wants, and then you make sure those boxes are filled. This can seem like a very minor form, but it can really hurt your seller or your buyer if you don't check some of the boxes, or you don't talk to them about the different options they have for security deposits or the amount of rent or those sort of things. If you don't check the right things, you could really hurt your clients. So make sure that you look over those contracts, make sure you go forward with those, make sure you understand those, and make sure you can help your clients with that. If you guys have any questions on this or any other contract issues, give me a call and we can talk about those. But if not, thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you soon. I hope this video helped you guys. And if you have any questions about it or random questions you can't seem to get answered, feel free to DM me or call me, and I will do my best to help you with whatever you need. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my page so that you can dominate in this industry as an agent. This page will help you with all sorts of tips and tricks, technology, and ideas on how to thrive in this industry while others seem to be struggling. Thanks, guys.